Dr. Owen Phelps is the director of the Yeshua Catholic International Leadership Institute and the author of 4 books, including The Catholic Vision for Leading Like Jesus, Introducing S3 Leadership, S3 standing for Servant, Steward, and Shepherd. This book is available at the back of the room for sale. While a student at St. Norberg College, where he graduated in 1969, Dr. Phelps began his career as a journalist, initially doing investigative work, and he also covered the Green Bay Packers, so I told him he might have at least a few friends in this room, but I did not promise the majority. He soon became the youngest newspaper editor in Wisconsin, and then rose to publisher of a newspaper chain and vice president of a multi-state newspaper publishing company before he was 30. In 2013, he retired after serving for 30 years as director of communications and publications for the Catholic Diocese of Rockford, Illinois. He has served on the faculty of the College of Business and Management at Cardinal Stritch University in Milwaukee. He worked extensively with Ken Blanchard, who you recognize, I'm sure, as the author of The 1 Minute Manager. And he has been married to his wife, Jane, for 48 years, has 5 children and 15 grandchildren. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Owen Phelps.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that's working. Good afternoon. I am really delighted to be here, and I'm grateful too. I want to thank Bishop Swain, our host. And if he's here, I don't know for sure. Let me just do a shout out. Go Badgers! Oh yeah, there's 2 of them here. What do you know? I'm just amazed at the size of this audience. This is, it's not going to sound great, but I'd like to give you a hand for being here. This is just amazing. I've been in contact with Joe Rutten, and Joe is the director of faith formation for the cathedral, and also works with the Catholic Men's Business Fraternity. Joe's been my contact for the last several months. When I saw this big crowd, I said, my goodness, Joe. He says, well, you better thank Bishop Swain, because for the last year, he's told his priests, whenever a businessman goes to confession, make sure you give him the penance to come to Sioux Falls today. Now, I want to thank, too, the members of the executive committee of the Catholic Men's Business Fraternity, whose devotion and hard work has made this day possible. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is a wonderful gathering. Now, I'm here today to talk to you about leading like Jesus, to share with you the principles of S3 leadership, servant, steward, and shepherd. But there's a couple of things I have to do first. And the first thing is that I want you to know that I'm a sinner. Now, I'm much repentant, mostly reformed, but a sinner nonetheless. Now, my friends, when they heard me practice the talk, said, Owen, you don't have to say that. Everybody knows that. I said, well, maybe not. Maybe there are people who don't know me and they won't know that. And he said, well, it won't take them long. I want to say a few words, too, about the conference's theme. Faith in business, a higher calling. As soon as I heard that was the theme from Joe, my mind raced to a document called Vocation of the Business Leader. This is the publication, the latest edition of that. In trying to retrieve a copy, which turned out to be a little more difficult than I anticipated, I learned that it's now in its 4th edition, and it now includes several quotations from Pope Francis. I want to share with you a couple of insights from that document. It was published actually by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And it begins with a rallying cry. It says, Christian business leaders, this is a time that calls for the witness of faith, the confidence of hope, and the practice of love. The document speaks of business people as collaborators in creation. Imagine that. Collaborators with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in creation itself. Now, creation, as you know, is an ongoing process. Until the second coming, it will never be complete. And God invites us, through the process of business, to participate in shaping and forming creation, in writing and rewriting history, in serving and uplifting humanity, in building his kingdom. In a phrase, we're called to be collaborators in creation. And that, my friends, is nothing if it is not a vocation. Let me draw one last insight from that document. It warns us. Obstacles to serving the common good come in many forms: corruption, absence of rule of law, tendencies toward greed, poor stewardship of resources. But the most significant for a business leader on a personal level is leading a divided life. This split between faith and daily business practice can lead to imbalance and misplaced devotion to worldly success, the document says. And it continues. The alternative path of faith-based servant leadership provides business leaders with a larger perspective and helps them to balance the demands of the business world with those of ethical social principles illuminated for Christians by the gospel. Ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the kind of leadership we're going to be talking about for the next several minutes. But we're not going to limit our focus to servant leadership, because it's clear from the Gospels that Jesus said more and did more than just endorse servant leadership. He went broader, he went deeper. He spoke of leading, as Pope Francis has now too, in terms of servant, steward, and shepherd, what we call S3 leadership. So we're going to speak of leadership today, describe it, explain it, and recommend it in that S3 context. But first, there are two things we must do. We must define leadership, and we must make it absolutely clear who a leader is. First, the definition. They warned me not to point that way. There we go. Thank you. Our definition of leadership that we share with Ken Blanchard and the ecumenical Lead Like Jesus movement is: anytime you seek to influence the thinking, behavior, or development of others, you are taking on the role of a leader. So who's a leader? Everyone. Everyone. Yep, even your mother-in-law. When does leadership begin? Are there any parents of preschool kids here today? Got a few, I see them. You know, about 2 years old, they start to walk and talk. And of course, they've got those words they say: mama, dada. Sometimes we get in a little competition over that, right? With our spouse. And then I've noticed with my grandchildren now, there's another word they want to say right away: moat. Moat. Have any of you heard the little kids say moat? They want the TV remote. Now, I don't recall anyone sitting down and explaining to them the remote, but they watch, they listen, and they know they want that remote. And why? Well, they want me to meet Mickey Mouse. They want you to meet Mickey Mouse. They want Mickey Mouse to take over the house. They want to influence us. They're trying to lead. So leadership starts at a very young age, and it includes everyone. Now, sometimes we lead even when we're not aware of it. As a former sports writer, I remember Charles Barkley, the NBA player. He got in trouble once, well, more than once. But one of the times that Charles got in trouble, he was criticized for being a bad example for kids, and his response was, I ain't no role model. Well, I hope he wasn't a role model for English grammar classes. But the fact of the matter is, he wanted those kids to buy his $150 gym shoes, and they were doing it. He wanted to sell them his jerseys and his warm-ups, and they were doing it. They were watching his every move on and off the court. They wanted to dress like him, to walk like him, and talk like him. And he says with a straight face, I ain't no role model. The sports writers were all over him. Give it up, Charles. Whether you like it or not, whether you intend to or not, you're a role model, and there's nothing you can do about it, period. You're leading. That's true of us as parents, too, isn't it? I don't want to pick on Charles. Let's take another example closer to home. You've got that 2 or 3-year-old child, innocent, clear-eyed, beautiful, marvelous, playing on the floor, and out of his or her mouth comes this profanity. Ever happen to any of you? You hear that kid swear? Yeah. And your first thought is, oh darn, they're watching too many R-rated movies. No, that's not the answer, is it? You think, uh-oh. Uh-oh. They've been listening to their mother. I got to talk to her about this. No, we know what happened, right? We were leading even when we weren't aware of it. We were leading even when we didn't want to lead. We were leading even when we wished to God that we weren't leading. But there it is. So now we have a definition of leader, and we know we all fit that definition, at least some of the time. Let's talk about the real power of leadership. When most of us hear the word leader, we think of someone with positional power, the boss. Fine. It's true as far as it goes, but let's discover right here and now real leadership power. And let's do it with a lived learning experiment. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and think about your relationship with one of your parents who helped influence you for the good. Now, if you were blessed with 2 good parents, I want you still to just think about one of them. The other won't mind. We won't tell them. Okay? And if you weren't blessed with good parents, and that happens sometimes, I want you to think of some mentor in your life who really helped bring you to the point you are today. I'm going to ask you to just spend some time with them, 30 seconds. Ready, set, close your eyes, go. Okay, time's up. I feel like the Grinch who stole Christmas. I got to ask you to come back to the room. I've got some questions for you. I want to ask you with a show of hands, and I will in just a minute, whether you were thinking primarily of something your parent said or your parent did. How many were thinking mostly of things their parents said? Look around the room, there's a couple of hands. How many were thinking primarily of things their parents did? Look around. A lot of hands. A lot of hands. Isn't that good news for those of you with teenage kids? Right? They aren't listening to you, but you may still be influencing them. I told this to a friend of mine, and all the color went out of his face. He went, oh my God. I wasn't happy with them ignoring me, but I sure wasn't expecting them to watch my behavior. I guess I got to clean up my act. So I haven't seen as much of him since then. I want those of you who were thinking of a parent's influence, which would be then all of you, but most especially those who were thinking of what a parent did, to put your hand up if your parent is deceased. If that parent is deceased. All right, will you leave them up if they've been deceased over 10 years? Over 15? Over 20? Any over 25? Still a couple of hands. Still a couple of hands. Thank you. Imagine that. That person has been dead for 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 or more years, and they're still influencing you. Imagine that. Do you still think of them now and then? Maybe every week? Maybe every day? They're still having an influence. That is real power. That is lasting power. That's the kind of power of leadership that we're here to talk about today. Now, some academician came along and said, all power can be put into 5 categories. There they are. I want to ask you about that 30 seconds you spent with that parent. How many of you were thinking of rewards, stuff they bought you? How many were thinking of punishments, things they took away from you? Well, how many were thinking, well, that was my dad, that's my mom, the law says I got to listen to him? Positional power? Wasn't a big thing? How many were thinking, oh my goodness, they were so very good at something. I just always admired their skill in some area? A few. And then how many were thinking about what's called referent power or charisma power, but charisma in the old Catholic sense of filled with the Spirit, they really, really cared about me? How many were thinking of that? Yeah, look at the hands go up. Look at the hands go up. They really cared about me. Now, when you look at where the power comes from and these kinds of power, you realize that the first 2, 1 is weak, reward power, 2, by the way, coercive power, actually with other adults does not correlate to influence at all, except negatively. You push, they push back harder. And then legitimate power, very, very weak power, as we could see in the room here. Those all come from outside the relationship. You know, if you have some kind of positional or legitimate power, you have the power to reward or to punish. Comes from outside the relationship. Expert power, where does expertise as an influence come from? Well, of course, it comes from the person who's the expert, the leader. But it also comes from the recognition of that expertise from the follower. So it grows out as a participatory process. And now that last one, the one that you said, almost each and every one of you, was the power that you felt in that 30 seconds. Where does that come from? The follower gives it to the leader, right? The follower gives it to the leader and invites that person in to have an influence in their life, an influence that can extend for decades beyond the grave. That's where real power lies. The follower gives it to the leader. Another example, if you finished high school, you had 12 teachers, or if it took a while, maybe 13 or 14. Or you changed classes in high school, so you got a bunch of different teachers. Some of them you can't even remember, right? Some of them you remember to this day. Some had an influence on you. Some not so much. I've got a few I'm still trying to forgive. But fortunately, I had many more good ones. But they all had the same positional power. They were all teachers. Yet some of them I invited into my life to make a difference, and others I shut out, or now completely forgot. Remember, the most powerful power that we can have is that power that people give to us to influence them. When they're convinced that we really, really care about them. And so now you know why Pope Francis says, let us never forget that authentic power is service. Isn't that the kind of leader you want to be? Don't you want followers to give you that kind of power to shape their lives for good, well beyond the course of your lifetime? Of course you do. Now, we said a little bit at the beginning about the vocation of business. I want to say something a little bit more general about the vocation of laity, something that Father Sirocco spoke about earlier. You know, at 18, I thought there were three things required of an adult Catholic: pray, pay, and obey, right? At 18, I didn't like any of them. Later, I kind of rationalized, well, Owen, if you could get a passing grade in 2 out of 3, that probably is passing. Focus on minimums. But about that time, our church's leaders were wrapping up that Second Vatican Council, and I want to refer to a document there, not the document on the laity, but on Lumen Gentium, arguably the most important of all those documents. And it doesn't contradict the document on the laity, but it just approaches it in a slightly different way. The document says, it is the special vocation of the laity to seek the kingdom of God by engaging in the temporal affairs and directing them according to God's will. They, meaning we, live in the world in each and every one of the world's occupations and callings and in the ordinary circumstances of social and family life, as it were, which form the context of our existence. There we are called by God to contribute to the sanctification of the world. Now, when Pope John Paul, now St. John Paul, came to the United States in 1987, he said much the same thing. Again, quoting, "As lay people actively engaged in this temporal order, you are called by Christ to sanctify the world and to transform it. This is true of all work, however exalted or humble, but it is especially urgent for those whose circumstances and special talent have placed them in positions of leadership or influence, men and women in public service, education, business, science, social communications, and the arts." Now, there's a word that pops up in both of these: sanctification. So you may be asking, what is sanctification? I know I was. So I went to that revered theological source, also known as, I'm keeping you in suspense here, it's not a, there we go. Thank you, Lord. That great theological source, Webster's Third International Dictionary. And here's what I found: an act or process of growth in God's grace by which people are set free from bondage of sin and exalted to a supreme love of God in service to his kingdom under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Wow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is our job as lay Catholics. You can see the bar is set pretty high. The first time I gave this much thought, it occurred to me, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing to go back to that praying, paying, and obeying program. We know that real power, lasting power, is not based on position. It's not based on structure. It's based on relationship. Now, of course, positional leadership opens up relationships and the potential for powerful relationships. But it will never fully flower unless the leader's heart is right. And to talk to you about this, I'm going to step away from the scriptures from the Second Vatican Council and talk to you about a business guru by the name of Jim Collins. Any of you familiar with Jim? He wrote the books Good to Great, Built to Last. Might be probably one of the 2 or 3 most popular business gurus there are out there. Now, he researched hundreds of for-profit companies, and he said that he found that how those companies perform relied more than anything else on what kind of leaders they had. And he said leaders come in 5 flavors. Let me show you what those are. From the bottom up, we have the highly capable individual. Nothing wrong with that. But lone rangers who don't grow often don't make very good business leaders. From there, we move up to the contributing team member. Do you know how to play well with others? Mom tried to help you with that. Some of them grow into competent managers, and then some grow into effective leaders, and then finally, some reach that pinnacle, the level 5 executive. Note how the sphere of influence expands in each case, from managing your own affairs to helping a team perform to leading larger groups. And you have to ask yourself, that level 4 effective leaders, how much better would the world be if every organization was led by effective leaders? I've had enough bosses to know that I was asking myself that question a long, long time ago. Well, Collins said, you know what? There's even that higher level, that level 5 executive, and these are unique and distinct people who lead organizations that do way better than like-kind organizations. And how are these people different and somehow more effective than effective leaders? And he said there were 2 things. He said the level 5 executive builds enduring greatness through a paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will. Think about that. When I first saw that, I was shocked. I thought if I was teaching in my MBA program 20 years ago that great leaders were humble, they might have hauled me away in a sleeveless jacket. But there it was, the result of researching hundreds of businesses. And I ask you, what leader in history has been more humble and willfully focused on his mission than Jesus Christ? Now, isn't that wonderful? Our modern empirical research is ever more confirming the wisdom of leading like Jesus. I've talked before a couple of business groups, and you'll have somebody come up at the break and say, oh my goodness, isn't that amazing that Jesus was so right about leadership so long ago? I say, yeah, who'd have thunk that God would be right? Ain't it amazing? Okay, at this point, we can say 4 things about leadership. Leadership is an influence process. Everyone is a leader. Powerful leadership is about relationship, not structure. And self-centered leaders are handicapped leaders. Jesus warned us of that, and now empirical research confirms it. Let's add a 5th assertion. Jesus is the best leadership teacher and role model of all time. So let's look at what Jesus does and says about leadership. What does he say? In the Gospel of Matthew, we find this. He tells his disciples, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Then what does he do? Does he walk the talk? Recall at the Last Supper in the Gospel of St. John, he washes the disciples' feet. Now these are filthy feet. Wrapped only in sandals, they've trudged through those dirt streets filled with animal excrement. No wonder washing feet was considered the lowest of the duties a servant could perform. Yet Jesus does it. And then he says to his disciples, if I, therefore, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do. Now stop and think where he is doing and saying this. It's the Last Supper. If you knew you were going to die tomorrow and you were bringing your best friends and your family together for dinner tonight, what would you talk about? The weather? How about how the market did today? Maybe the menu. Wow, isn't this a great piece of lamb we're having tonight? Wow. I know some people at dinner, they talk about what they had for lunch. Would you talk about your favorite sports team? No, I don't think so. I think at your Last Supper, you'd talk about what matters most to you. You'd want those closest to know that you love them. You'd want to leave them with some kind of a sense of legacy. Do you think it was any different with Jesus? When Jesus talks about leadership at the Last Supper, and he does it in 2 of the 4 Gospels, he's telling us that how we lead matters to him. And it just didn't matter to him, it mattered to the early Christian community. The people who remembered the important things that he did and said and wrote them down in what we have today as the Gospels. Because it mattered to Jesus and his disciples, it should matter to us right now too, shouldn't it? Now let's be clear. Servant leadership is not about letting the students run the school, the kids take over the house, or the patients run the asylum. Jesus didn't tell his disciples, okay, now you're on the team, go do whatever you want. No, he said, do what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is the will of the Father. Stewardship, S2, leadership. Jesus was a steward leader. He said these things at the Last Supper. The words I speak to you, I do not speak on my own. The Father who dwells in me is doing his works. Later, the world must know that I love the Father and that I do just as the Father has commanded me. And still later, he talks to the Father directly. He says, I glorified you on earth by accomplishing the work you gave me to do. Everything you gave me is from you. Jesus is a steward leader. He always remembers everything comes from the Father. Now, steward leadership also reflects a truth found in the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, when God gives Adam and Eve dominion over the planet's resources. In that moment, we are made God's stewards. As Pope Francis notes in his most recent encyclical, Laudato Si, this planet, quote, is our common home, entrusted to us by God for the good of all humanity across all time. He writes, our sister, our planet, now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the good with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her Lord and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. Good stewards do not plunder. Good steward leaders do not see themselves as lords and masters. Good steward leaders serve the Lord and their Savior by making sure that the gifts of the earth are used in sustainable ways that put the good of all humanity through all time ahead of our own instant gratification. Now, one more thing about steward leaders. Obviously, as a matter of law, the chairpersons and the CEOs and other leaders of publicly owned companies are not the owners of those companies. They may have some stock in these companies, and we speak of them as the heads of their companies, but that's wrong. They're not really the owners, they're caretakers. They have legal and moral responsibilities, not only to their shareholders, but to all of their many stakeholders. And for the sake of the market economy, they must be held accountable, not as owners, but as stewards. Bill Ford, the last Ford family member to head the Ford Motor Company, proved he was a good steward when, for the sake of the company, he realized his skill set wasn't adequate, and he stepped aside and hired Alan Mulally to serve as president and CEO in September 2006. Dennis Kozlowski was not a good steward. As CEO of a public company, Tyco International, this Seton Hall graduate was paid more than $100 million a year. But that didn't stop him from allegedly having Tyco pay for his $30 million New York City apartment. And when the $2 million bill came for his second wife's birthday party, he had Tyco pay half, $1 million. Now in 2005, no surprise, he was convicted of taking more than $100 million from Tyco in unauthorized bonuses, art, and a fee for a friend. He served 8 years in prison. And as you may have guessed, despite her $2 million birthday party, his wife Karen didn't stick around long. She divorced him in 2006. So Kozlowski told the parole board when he applied to get out of prison that he was, quote, living in a CEO-type bubble and, quote, had a strong sense of entitlement. I'm very sorry I did that. I knew I was doing something wrong at some level when I did it. My conscience told me one thing, but my sense of entitlement allowed me to rationalize what I did. Now, if Tyco had been his company, he would have been legally entitled to use its assets as he saw fit. But it wasn't his. It was a publicly traded company owned by thousands of stockholders, beholden to 1,000 other stakeholders. He was the company's steward. Now, need we mention Bernie Madoff, Kenneth Lay, Jeffrey Skilling, or Bernie Ebbers? Stewards, not owners. It's a lesson that our business community here in the United States and some places still has to learn. Servant leadership. S1, it's not about me. Steward leadership, S2, it's not mine. Shepherd leadership, S3, people are precious. Let's talk about shepherd leadership for a moment. When I first heard the idea, I didn't like it at all. I know right where I was. I was in an elevator going up to a class at San Diego University, a fine Catholic school in, of all places, San Diego. And I was with Ken Blanchard and Phil Hodges, the co-founders of Lead Like Jesus. And I was telling them, look, we can't just rely on servant leadership, because as long as it's mine, it will always be about me. We have to have S2, steward leadership. It's not mine. Ken agreed right away, and then he said, well, Owen, what about a third S? And I said, fine, Ken. I mean, he was Ken, right? If you think we should have 3, let's go with 3. And then, of course, I had to ask, what's the third S, Ken? And he said, shepherd. I hated it. I mean, I've been around Catholic Church long enough since birth that I know who the dumb sheep are going to be. They're going to be us laity. I didn't like that. I had an ego that said, no. We can get past that. But I'm a little bit of a diplomat too, so I said to Ken, well, Ken, you know what? That's very interesting. Isn't that a wonderful word? Interesting. So value neutral. I said, I'll go home and look into it. And so I decided to keep my promise. I got home and I looked at the scriptures, and I realized when I looked at the teaching about shepherd leadership that the people of Jesus' time knew something that most of us don't. And what they knew about was sheep. Now, we tend to think of sheep as these sweet little creatures, all docile. I can't think of a sheep or a lamb without thinking of this plaster shepherd I have with a sheep on his shoulders that I put in the creche every year. Isn't that sweet? The people who lived in Jesus' time knew that wasn't the case. Sheep are not necessarily docile. Here's what Jesus said about sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Do the sheep follow the shepherd because he has a title? No, they have no idea of that. They follow him because he knows them and they know him. They trust him. He's earned that trust by getting to know them. Lacking such a relationship, when you open the gate, the sheep run away. Jesus knew that. His audiences knew that. The sheep are under no expectation to be docile. They're under no obligation to be docile. How they behave in relation to the shepherd is all on the shepherd. It's all on the leader. And once I realized that, I decided I could embrace shepherd leadership. And I'm glad I did, because Jesus had more to say about it. And that would be this: I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not a shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. A good shepherd leader, like the good shepherd, focuses not on himself or herself, but on the welfare of the sheep. Now, isn't that the way for a good parent? Our children's welfare comes first. I mean, my mom, and I'm the oldest of 10, she went without a single new dress for years, so that her children could have food on the table, school clothes, and tuition for Catholic school education. We all sacrifice for our children, don't we? Look what happens to the self-centered leader in this account. When he spots trouble, he runs away to save himself. Now the sheep become wolf's food, and he's out of a job, and everybody loses. The good shepherd, he sticks around. He protects the sheep. And who wins? Well, the sheep do, and the shepherd. It's a real win-win. And it's what happens when people are led by humble, selfless, mission-centered leaders. Jesus was one. Will you be another? By the way, Pope Francis asked that very question of the world's priests on Holy Thursday, March 8th, 2013. He said, "This is what I'm asking you. Be shepherds with the smell of the sheep." So, okay, I was right. We're the dumb sheep, right? Not really. Not really. We laity are the sheep in this particular paradigm. But guess what? We're not dumb. And we cannot reasonably be expected to be docile unless our spiritual welfare is looked after by good shepherds, clergy and laity alike. What is Pope Francis saying here? He's saying that leadership is not about position, it's about relationships. He wants his pastors to have good and close relationships with the people. Now, beyond the church and the business world, we laity are called to be the shepherds and to sanctify the world. Will we do it? Are we willing? Are we able? Let's talk about willing and able for a minute. How do we become more willing and more able to be Jesus-like S3 leaders in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities, in our parishes? Well, I have 4 answers for you. They're the 4 H's of Jesus-like leadership: heart, head, hands, and habits. Let's talk about the heart. It's first because it's the most important, the very basis on which a commitment to S3 Jesus-like leadership begins. We all have a heart problem. We've all heard the call to look out for old number one. The problem is, who is number one in our lives? Jesus told us who number one should be. When someone asked him what was the most important commandment, he replied, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. So who is number one? God is number one. And what about me? Well, Jesus says I'm tied with my neighbor in second place. And remember, Jesus didn't just say, well, these are two more commandments, now you got 12. He said one of them was the greatest and the first, and the other is like it. How are you going to make God number one in your life? It's not easy. I submit it's something we have to do over and over again, at least once a day, and likely more often. If we're going to do it, it'll require the cooperation of our head, hands, and habits. That means it takes more than good intentions. When I left the rough and tumble world of investigative journalism to work for the church, I thought, oh, great! Now I get to work with a group of people who all have good hearts. They're fundamentally on the same side. After a week, I found myself saying this prayer on the way to work every day. God save me from people with only good intentions. Does that ever cross your mind? If not, you may want that prayer. Everybody had good hearts at the diocese, good intentions, but we had messes everywhere. Obviously, it takes more than good intentions. We have to acquire and hone the skills to be great leaders. We have to work on the head. I'd like to say more to you, but my time is running down. I do want to say this. I want to share my 3 prayers with you. Doesn't that sound scary? 3 whole prayers? Mine are short. Be not afraid. You are not alone. The Lord will provide. Keep those assurances in mind, and you will be walking as a Jesus-like leader every day of your life. I know you can do it because I know God has equipped you to do it. So may God continue to bless you. May you continue to serve Him with every day and every breath of your life. Thank you for your attention today. God love you because I know He does. Amen.